We'll start today's Connect and Share. It's number 117, and it's the Connect and Share for Outdoors New South Wales and ACT. Laurie sends her apologies today, and we'll be going through a bunch of information that's relevant to the outdoor industry. And we don't have a guest this week, but we do have a couple of videos on, I guess, discussing gender and cultural diversity in boards as a way of, because nominations are open for that in close for that in 3 days. But before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, traditional custodians of the land on which we all work and play. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people, and I pay respects to all First Nations people, past, present, and emerging. And yeah, as I was just sort of mentioned, board nominations are due in 3 days, and we're really keen to get diversity in the new board that's part of the new direction for Outdoors New South Wales and ACT. I'm going to ask James to post that survey in the chat, which is your way of nominating either yourself or someone else for a position on the board. And I'm just gonna, yeah.
Sorry, what's the current profile of the board?
It's currently white men with one female, but yes, so definitely looking to change that.
Well, they're all young white men when you're looking from my perspective, so yeah.
So here's just a little video about cultural diversity.
If ASX directors were 100 people, 2 would be culturally diverse women, 6 would be Anglo-Celtic women, 28 would be culturally diverse men, and 64 would be Anglo-Celtic men. Across Australian institutions and various sectors, about 97% of Australian leadership is occupied by those with an Anglo-Celtic background. Our report card on leadership within an Australian context is pretty bleak, but we have made significant progress. If we think about where we were in 2009, where only 5% of women comprised new recruits onto boards. In April of this year, for instance, women comprised 29.6% of board members on ASX 200 companies. There's a very clear business case as to why we need diversity on boards, particularly cultural diversity. Having an ethnically diverse senior leadership suite results in a profit return to your organisation anywhere between 25 to 37% annually. The multicultural dollar is worth $75 billion annually in Australia.
And I understand that Outdoors New South Wales and ACT is a not-for-profit entity, but it's still the representation of the diverse representation is so vital for our industry to sort of bring it up into the 21st century. I'll just play another video. This is just a short snippet from a recent June this year forum on workplace gender equality and how to create gender equality workplaces.
Continue to adapt in order for that true cultural change to occur. So there's an opportunity as well on the other side of things to bring some of that practical experience of implementing real cultural change into the research domain as well, and look at how we can combine that expertise.
And do you find it hard to convince people? Do you need to put a case as to why change matters?
I think most organisations these days, particularly through the environment, social and governance, the ESG agenda, are very clear that they need to take action. And of course, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency and other government agencies have made that pretty obvious to most organisations. Where I think it's difficult is often how to go about that change. So there might be a pretty clear view that we do need to do something, making the decision and then with discipline and rigour, managing the change process is often where people need some support.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to Geraldine now. It's Reconciliation Week. Michelle, in her opening, referred to intersectionality, to looking at the fact that, not all disadvantage is about gender. We get compounding disadvantage. A friend of mine in London put this beautifully. She works for a very major global organisation that went about diversifying its corporate board and did a big unveiling of its new corporate board. My friend is a black woman. When they unveiled the corporate board, there were women on it, but all white women. And she did make the comment, well, how does that relate to me? To which she was told, oh, don't worry, we're getting to racism next. Now, that's not how people...
And I just wanted to finish that video on that. And I might play a bit more of that afterwards, after we finish the main meeting, if anybody is interested. I get another very amazing opportunity is coming up in Ulladulla at the end of November. And that's a free 2-day masterclass for all people who are members of Outdoors New South Wales and ACT. And it's 2 full days of incredible presenters from across the state and territory, bringing in all, unique, their own specialties of outdoor and experiential education and anything to do with the outdoors. So please register for that. And come along. We'd love to see you. So Laurie this week has been in Ballarat representing the outdoor industry at the Australian Regional Tourism Convention. There were also some agritourism tools launched at this event, which are now located in resources in your membership hub, should you wish to look at an agritourism offering, and these might assist you. In addition to this, the New South Wales State Government have released their final agritourism planning policy, which complements this and comes into place in December 2022. So if you want to know more about that, you're best to speak with Laurie, as she's undoubtedly got a wealth of knowledge on this, moving forward with this. Then we get to Kosciuszko National Park. As many of you would already know, there's been a lot of recent sort of upgrades in the park area there. But historically, Kosciuszko National Park has not allowed any commercial use. There's been a turn of events recently where New South Wales Parks and Wildlife Service have proposed the change to allow commercial operators, as they recognise that by access, people will understand more about the park and the need for them to be conserved. They also recognise that it's our commercial operators that care and look after the parks and their use. I know that there has been some commercial operation in national parks, but I guess this is just bringing more voice to what is allowed and not allowed within the parks. Does anybody want to make any comment on that? I know David and Margot, you've probably got a lot, and David, both Davids, you've got a lot of understanding of this.
Okay, so wilderness areas tend to be, there's a couple of different areas in national parks. One of them is a wilderness area, which tends not to have roads or tracks, easy access, and that's one of the, it's probably a little bit better able to manage the natural diversity and stuff by limiting the number of people that can go into those that are better equipped. Yeah.
Yes.
In some cases, you've got to get special permission. So that's why in many states, they've kept the wilderness areas out from commercial operations. But I don't think they ban schools, for instance, from going into wilderness areas, or TAFEs or universities. So there are already dependent groups going in. I guess the argument really is how do we manage wilderness areas so that to limit the damage that humans might do, rather than who actually goes in there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, David. Margot, do you?
Yeah, no, I was just going to concur with David. Am I on mute?
No, you're loud and clear. Good.
Yeah, so we've always been able to do commercial operations, but we're not allowed to camp in the wilderness areas. So this will be interesting to have a look at what specifically they are suggesting. I'm just trying to look it up. I've got it up on the other screen now, so I'll have a good look at that and comment.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Yeah, good to have clarification. I didn't read through it properly in advance, and as I was reading it, I was thinking wilderness areas. It didn't make sense to me, but now it does. So thank you.
Yeah, and we operated quite a lot in wilderness areas with school groups. So the additional caution for that, for any operations in there, is they are remote, they are inaccessible, and you do need the right level of training and experience to go in there, and preparation and planning. And so, but we use the Shoalhaven, so we use the Ettrimer Wilderness Area, which is in the Moreton National Park. We also used wilderness areas in the Buttawang National Parks, and they're amazing programs. I mean, the size and scope of the things that you can do in those areas is fantastic, but it is the consideration around the high volume of traffic. And so if you look at how Lake Urunga gets trashed by every single, and not out of negligence, but there's a lot of operations in Lake Urunga because it's a great area. If you were to translate that up into the Shoalhaven Gorge, there's potential for a lot of damage for commercial operators. So I'm in two minds as to whether commercial operators should be in there, those areas. But I love using it as a school when I was involved.
Great, thanks, David. Thanks for that.
And it says on the website that submissions close on the 18th of November.
Oh, fantastic. So if you have any feedback or comments on that, yeah, just make your submission through the National Parks website.
I mean, an alternative way of managing areas that high impact is going to damage, could be the way that Parks Victoria do in some areas where only commercial operators, if you want to use a certain site, you've got to use a commercial operator, and the commercial operator has lots of restrictions and can be managed by parks. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but it is one of the ways to limit the size of groups, because generally speaking, schools can't be controlled. They just go and, they're not part of permit systems or compliance systems, whereas commercial operations, the land manager can actually control them, or should be able to control them.
Yeah, great point.
Are you saying I'm out of control, David?
Normally you are. I don't know what your school groups are like, yeah?
Oh, manic. But no, and I take that point as well, because we've come across school groups in those areas that shouldn't have been in those areas. And I do think there does need to be a level of management in that, but we were self-regulated. And so whilst we were operating within the scope of what we believed was really good environmental practice and sustainable practice, other schools weren't when we ran into them on some occasions. But if I think of, say, Lord Howe Island, if anyone's been to Lord Howe Island and you've got Mount Gower, only that commercial operator, I think there's 2 commercial operators that can take people up that mountain, and no one can just self-lead or go on that trip themselves. So there could be some possible, benefit in what you're suggesting, David.
The other thing is that Andrew Knight and myself in Victoria have been talking about having a look at our failed LTO system down here, which was supposed to be reviewed about 3 or 4 years ago. And one of the things we're talking about is actually having all dependent groups, clubs, schools, anyone that takes a lead group out, having to be part of the permit system, so they then understand group sizes, restrictions in certain areas. So managing all of the larger groups better, or the potentially larger groups better, might be the other answer. But then that comes down to resources and the ability of governments to actually have the will to want to do that.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Thanks for all those comments. That was great. Now, Dan, can I ask you to talk us through this calling for volunteers in December, if you're available? Dan? No, Dan gave us a great wrap up last week of this event in Woden on the 2nd and 3rd of December. It's I think he said it was about a 5-day event altogether. Just sort of showcasing the area, and I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of it is, but just getting...
I can give it a little bit of background if you like. I met with Dan today. Okay, so it's for the PCYC. It's a fundraiser. For the organisations in Canberra, as well as promoting adventure. I think the Prime Minister is actually going to be one of the people that pay to go down to raise money. So we can always either pat him on the back or use a sharp knife, depending on our political bias. But there is going to be some involvement of Outdoors Victoria to get promotion of Outdoors Victoria in a bit more understanding of Outdoors Victoria / ACT in the area. And there's going to be one rope on a couple of days, I think it's only a couple of days, that can be run by our volunteers and where our members are able to participate and get the experience. There's also an opportunity for some involvement of abseil instructors who might want to learn a little bit more about managing a reasonably major abseiling system, and they can be part of the see and watch, or handle the visitors and things like that. So there's a few things that Laurie will put out, I imagine, along the way.
Great, thanks for that, David. Sounds like something excellent to be part of. Oops, wrong way. There we go. We're going forward. There we go. There's an expression of interest open now for the Adventure Guides subcommittee. So if you're interested in being part of that, just send an email to Laurie regarding your experience and keenness to become part of the Adventure Guides subcommittee. And there've been some recently appointed new committee members for the Backcountry subcommittee and the First Nations subcommittee. Those people are getting all their paperwork in at the moment, and hopefully next week those people will be revealed who they are. And there's a new member for the Climate Change subcommittee, who's Robin Fox. And we thank them for their service on this subcommittee and getting the climate change agenda front and centre, because without a climate, without taking action on climate change, we won't have an outdoor industry. So that's obviously really vital to do some extreme work in that department. Just trying to move through to the next slide. Somehow my computer just doesn't like changing slides. There we go. Oh my gosh, back to the same one. There we go. And at the end of October, the Mountain Film Festival is on tour, and it will be at the Orpheum in Cremorne on October the 26th, and in Canberra at the Dendy Cinemas on October the 27th. And it's just a good way to see some interesting filmmaking and some, you know, get yourself excited for being out in the outdoors. Just there's some new modules from the Office of the Children's Guardian regarding responding to reportable allegations, and just some different e-learning modules available. So it's great to brush up on your current knowledge in this area. And I'll just ask James to put that link in the chat, just so you can access that free e-learning, which is vital to keep our industry, the young people in our industry, safe. The employment white paper. This provides a roadmap for Australia to build a bigger, better trained and more productive workforce, to boost income and living standards and create more opportunities for more Australians. This white paper will build on the outcomes of the Jobs and Skills Summit, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago, and will have an overarching focus on the objectives of full employment and productivity growth for the benefit of all Australians, along with women's economic participation and equality. It'll explore issues, frameworks and policy approaches relevant to the future of Australia's labour market for the medium and long term, taking into account a diverse range of perspectives from across Australia. And it's just, yeah, a chance to have your say on what goes into the white paper. So jump on that link there, which James will put in the chat as well, so you can, yeah, have your say on the white paper and the future of Australia. A few grants are around at the moment. This Regional Investment Activation Fund is a large grants, and there's 2 streams. One is the, and they're both for businesses. One's between 2 million and 20 million to deliver sustainable employment opportunities, activate new industries, promote cluster development and drive increased productivity, innovation and competitiveness of businesses in regional New South Wales. And that closes, that's open at the moment, closes the 14th of November. So if you have a gigantic idea and are keen to get a 50% contribution for the total project cost, just have a look and see what the terms and conditions are for that. But each of these must be based in regional New South Wales and support sustainable employment opportunities, and must be completed by May 2025. So there's also the second stream for between 1 and 10 million, and that doesn't close till 31st of December 2024. So again, if you've got a big idea and there's more time to develop your concept, to get some government funding for that. There's some other grants for festivals and events for multicultural communities, and they're between $5,000 and $15,000 towards running celebrations between 1st of February and 30th of June next year. So applications for those close on the 28th of October. And just to mention, this week is Diwali, so which is a celebration of the kind of Hindu community. So if you see lots of lights and fireworks, well, probably not fireworks in New South Wales, but in the ACT, it's the sort of light festival of light is a big part of Diwali. So yeah, there's lots of other multicultural festivals that could be, you could get some funding to promote those for next year. Also some other funding for upgrade, restoration and construction of surf clubs. So that's the state government, New South Wales state government surf club facility program. And that funding round closes the 1st of November. And there's also the Australian Heritage Grants Program. I'm not too clear on the details of that, but if you put into your search browser, Australian Heritage Grants Program, you'll find the information for that, which closes the 7th of November as well. So a bunch of grants closing soon for some great things to promote our different parts of our industry. And next week, Tim Entwistle will be our guest. And he's just completed his PhD, I believe, with Western Sydney Uni. He was one of the speakers at the recent National Outdoor Education Conference, and he was talking about bushcraft there. So I'm not clear on the details of his presentation next week, but it's definitely his findings from his recent PhD and talking about how people can be involved in further research. So join us next week for that. And I'm just going to open the floor to anybody who's got any comments, anything to do with the industry that's been going on for them or for the industry in the past week. Just, yeah. Margot, do you have anything? No? Yep.
No, not really, no.
Who else have we got? We've got Stuart. Is there anything that you would like to mention? No? Jeffrey? I see you there, but oh, I can't hear you though. You're not on mute, but I still can't hear you. That's okay. No worries. Oh, David Chitty's got his hand up. David.
Yeah, talking about the board, getting new types of people on the board. I think to my mind, that's something we're going to have to work on over a period of time. I think the first issue with boards is diversity, and is a key issue. But the first issue is actually finding people or training people to think strategically and understand what the role of boards is, rather than they're not an operational organisation. Yeah, they don't make those day-to-day decisions or interfere. They set the big picture stuff, and I don't think boards, not only in our industry, generally fully understand their roles and responsibilities. So I reckon that's the first step. And for our younger people or people from other diverse communities, we probably need to have some leadership, training, higher level leadership training that actually teaches people to think strategically what their roles and responsibilities are at higher level positions, so that they feel confident to apply. I think a lot of people, even more experienced, many older experienced people, would be loath to become a member of a board because they don't actually understand what boards do, or if they do, they don't think they could actually do that job.
That's a really good point. That's absolutely right. An understanding of what it is, and not to feel intimidated, I guess. That I'm sure that's a big part of why people wouldn't put their hand up, particularly minorities who already feel some hesitance to participate. It just, the lack of understanding increases their hesitance to participate further.
There's also quite a lot of time and effort involved, and they're volunteers. So over the decades in the future, we may need to think about how we remunerate board members of our peak body boards, in some way for their time, Not everybody has the funding, to pay for themselves when they're not doing work.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm not saying we do it. I guess we've got to be a bit open-minded in our future discussions and do some planning, I guess is what I'm suggesting.
For sure. And just finally, before I put that video back on for anybody who's interested, just to acknowledge the incident that occurred last Friday, and if anybody's got any questions about the abseiling incident last Friday, to forward those to Laurie, as I know she's very she's spent a lot of time consulting with all the people involved in that. So a terrible loss for the industry, and yes, for the family, of course. Okay, so we might leave it there for today, and please stay on if you'd like to hear more of this this video. Otherwise, I'll see you next week, and I believe Laurie will be back in the chair, so that will be great. And thanks so much for showing up. See you soon.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just trying that again. Can people hear me now?
Yes, we can, Jeffrey. Yes.
This is good news. No, all good. I've sorted my problems out, obviously. Now, I joined late, so I didn't get the piece on the diversity in the board. Our focus is gender or diverse groups from the industry.
Both, I guess. And David Chitty just brought up a great point, was, and it's a long game. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So it's it's something that we can definitely work towards. And as we gain a greater understanding of what the industry needs and how it can be best served by such a diverse range of stakeholders, to create a better future for everyone, and a greater reach as well for the industry. When I think of the kind of, I guess, the population diversity of Western Sydney, for example, and there's families, kids there, adults there who would love the opportunity of participating in the outdoors, and who may not get the opportunity through school or work or whatever, but sort of, opening up access to of the industry within these sorts of areas and sectors.
Thank you.
That's my personal take on it anyway.
Cool.
No, I'm not representing the industry here. I'm just representing Helen Cooper. So please take it as that.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'll play this. And
corporate board. My friend is a black woman. When they unveiled the corporate board, there were women on it, but all white women. And she did make the comment, well, how does that relate to me? To which she was told, oh, don't worry, we're getting to racism next. Now, that's not how people live their lives. You know that from the work you do with refugees. How can we make sure that as we're pursuing greater diversity, that it's true diversity from all perspectives?
Thank you very much. So I sit on the board of the ANU Centre for Asian Australian Leadership, which is partnering with Jewel and really excited to be part of this event. So at the Centre for Asian Australian Leadership, what we're really recognising is that there is a gap in terms of ethnic representation across Australia's public institutions as well as the corporate sector. And so we're really trying to advocate and put in place evidence-based approaches to increasing that. Some of you may have seen that the Governance Institute and Watermark recently released the 2022 Board Diversity Index, and it showed that, again, the typical director of the ASX 300 companies is 60 years old, white, male, and from an Anglo-Celtic background. And in fact, while we're making progress in terms of appointing female directors, we've seen a 60% to 70% increase since 2016 in terms of the number of directors in the ASX 300. Cultural diversity is stagnating. So 90% of those directors in the ASX 300 are from an Anglo-Celtic background and another 3% European. So if you think about Australia's population, and you think about the fact that that's stagnating, it's really quite problematic in terms of organisations being able to understand the customers, the markets they're working with, their people, and just to really reflect what Australia looks like. So we're really hoping that we can see things like cultural data legislation. We've seen the impact that the Workplace Gender Equality Act had in terms of gender equality. So we'd love to see that. And also at CAL, the centre, we're also looking at a project around counting for change. So really getting ethnic diversity into the census in an appropriate way, following a process of research to identify how you would best do that. And also looking more at the business case around cultural diversity and leadership.
And when you talk to people about change in this area, do they get it? Do you find it hard to convince people that this broader approach to diversity is in the interests of their organisation? You mentioned in your answer, for example, understanding your customer base. Do people see, apart from the doing the right thing driver, do they intuitively get that there can be productivity and economic drivers here?
I mean, I think there's mixed research. There's not very much recent research around this in terms of the business case. I think if you look at organisations themselves, I mean, there's many organisations that do get it. I don't think it's a coincidence that all of the organisations that I've been a senior executive have had markets overseas and strong customer base. In fact, at Virgin, we had 3 directors who were from Asian backgrounds because they were our shareholders. I think there's organisations that definitely do get that we need that representation. But I think we've seen perhaps too much of an emphasis in terms of one aspect of diversity, in terms of thinking about, as you said, putting women onto boards and not casting the net wide enough in terms of thinking about the broader ethnic diversity that we need to represent. So I think it's hard when we don't measure it. It's not in the census. It's very hard for organisations to collect it. There's self-reporting that is done in some organisations. But I think until we have an agreed methodology for how we capture that data, it's also hard to establish the business case as well. So we need some evidence to help us.
Need some evidence. And Mary, you're going to add to that?
I was just going to give people an update, is that we're now starting some work on how we collect that broader diversity data as part of the WGEA data set, and that will enable us with that data to do all the analysis that we do on a gender basis, on a broader diversity basis as well. But the work we've got to do is work out how we support employers to capture that information accurately in the first place, so they have the capacity to report through to us. But we've asked a question in this year's reporting, which is just underway at the moment, about who is collecting data. So we have that baseline of how many have got it already. And so we're then in a position to say, well, let's start collecting it, or actually doing the work to help companies collect it so that we can too. But we're on a pathway for that, which I think is very exciting.
And similarly, the Gender Equality Act in Victoria asks organisations to report on intersectional gender inequality. This time around, we've got very little data on that. And so and we've been talking to Mary as well about how we collect this kind of data more routinely and in ways that don't cause people discomfort.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that came out of the research I referred to earlier about gender pay gap reporting is when you analyse all of this globally, there's a lot of sensitivity in some nations to any form of ethnic diversity reporting. Nations in Europe who obviously in World War II saw genocidal violence against Jewish people. There's actually laws that prevent employers asking people about their ethnic background or recording their ethnic background, because that's part of their cultural predisposition about how you generate better equality. So it's interesting to see those differences, and happily we're in a nation where I think people would understand that getting this data can be a great spur for change rather than a great spur for some forms of discrimination. So interesting global outlook. Mary, I'm going to come back to you. I know one of the things that you're trying to do, the agency is trying to do, is to look at an employer of choice designation. And whenever we look at the economic data at the moment, often it's full of talk about inflation and cost of living pressures. It's also full of talk about skills and labour force constraints. People are talking about the war for talent. How do their businesses get the people that they need? How does being an employer of choice play into that, the kind of decisions someone might make about where they would best prefer to go and work?
So we've had an employer of choice for gender equality citation for a long time now. It's had various forms, and we're in the process of reforming that to create a pathway for more companies to do it. About 120 companies are considered employers of choice, but they very clearly, and especially the ones who use it well, see it as a differentiator for their recruitment processes. They see it as an opportunity to very clearly signal that they've gone through a comprehensive process, that they care about these issues, that they're driving change. They're continuing to improve because the challenge, the criteria improves and gets harder each and every year. But we also know about the current generation of employees, that they care about these things. They're values driven, that meaning and purpose is important, and they live in a way, in a different way than generation, and they have expectations in relation to their workplaces and having a broader perspective. So I think the combination of being able to say that you're committed to it and that you're taking very serious action, leading the way, combined with the workforce that's coming through, makes these sort of citations significant differentiators and attractors of talent.
Could I add to that? Because I think in the current environment, in the very tight labour market that we find ourselves in, the ability of organisations to avail themselves of all of the available talent becomes even more important. We did a survey earlier this year, which is called What's Keeping Us Up at Night? It's a survey of CEOs across Australia. And for the first time, talent was the top risk by a long way. And when we were asking people to look 3 to 5 years out, talent was still one of the top risks. It trumps cyber as risks that organisations and CEOs are seeing. So I think it's a real moment where the ability to attract and retain people, to attract them by making sure that we're not discriminating against anybody in the labour market for, dumb reasons, but also then the ability to create that sense of belonging and meaning that you talked about becomes even more important at this moment in history.
I'm surprised the answer to that wasn't counting in undecided seats is keeping people up at night, but all depends on the time frame of the survey. Nikki, I'm going to come back to you and ask you to compare the public sector with the private sector. Many people, I think, in the private sector would think to themselves, look, it's a lot easier for the public sector. You don't have as many competitive pressures. pressures, you don't have the market bearing down on you about your share price, the quarterly returns, all of that kind of stuff. It's much easier to do this big transformative change in a public sector environment. Do you think that's true?
Look, I think perhaps it's true in some parts of the public sector, and it's certainly easier for government to regulate organisations over which they have a lot more control, and obviously public sector work is using public money. It should be model work. They should be model workplaces. But when you think about the public sector, you think about police and emergency services, fire, you think about transport and logistics, and then you think about office work. Those are very different. Those are very different workplaces, and you have the same thing in the private sector. So I think the same principles apply, and the work that Mary's organisation, WGEA, has been doing for many years is looking at what works in terms of workplace gender equality. And we know that leadership's important. We know that measuring and reporting and making a plan and, you know, then measuring your progress and so forth are really important. And that applies, I think, across the board in any workplaces. So yes, there are some differences, but I don't think they're necessarily as big as we might think they are. But I think where we know what works in some workplaces may have to be applied differently depending on the workplace situation. So you might, well, whilst it's important to have safe and respectful workplaces where women and anyone, men, people of other genders are not discriminated against, how you might go about intervening to create change might be different depending on the workplace and not just whether it's public or private sector.
I'm going to ask now about the post-COVID environment, though even as I say post-COVID, I'm very careful about using that terminology because the pandemic is by no means over, and we're obviously sitting here with an audience all wearing masks, which we would not have done before we were all talking about and having our lives upended by COVID. But as people have gone back to work, the rigour of lockdowns has ended. Has this given us an opportunity to see change in the workplace? I'm going to turn first here to Jane. I think you're fond of referring to this period as volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. Can you take us through all of those adjectives and what they spell?
Sure. So the word that's become VUCA, yes, as you say, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, absolutely characterises the nature of the environment that all of us find ourselves in across both public and private sector. And I think COVID really was just an acceleration of what we were already seeing in the nature of the complexity in particular that organisations and leaders within them are grappling with. I think COVID gave us some positives in terms of advancing the idea that flexible working could work. You know, as we all know, we all did it overnight, notwithstanding those employees, of course, who don't work in an office environment and have to turn up to work. I think if you look at the Productivity Commission study in September of last year, it highlighted that lots of people, in fact, the majority of people, 3/4, considered they were at least as productive working from home as they were working in the office. And the other piece of data that was interesting in there was that many employees were willing to accept a pay cut or change jobs in order to continue to work from home. So I think it's notable that while that's the case, and while all of that uncertainty that we were faced with meant that we were able to respond by working from home, I think one of the key things that we're now, as we come back into, even if the workplaces are not quite what they were before, is how we take the advantage of that, particularly the flexibility that was awarded to people, and of course the ability for employees to balance their work. Balance is probably not the right word, to manage their work and their life alongside each other, and the opportunities to do that. Now, there's obviously some perceived costs in that, where people perceive that perhaps the manager FaceTime, the ability to have the water cooler conversations, the ability to engage in collaborative, creative work can potentially be damaged. So I don't think we've landed on exactly what's going to happen yet, but I think we know that we've got to monitor the effects of this hybrid working on all of those things that we already track around, gender pay gap, around promotions, around all those things where people have legitimate concerns.
I'm going to ask if anybody else has got an observation on the post-COVID environment. I mean, one thing that we've been thinking about at Jewel is it obviously sounds fantastic for occupations that can combine virtual work with in-office work, that there are, plenty of options and people can, self-select as to whether they're going to work from home or not. But I do think, given we know that domestic and caring labour is not equitably distributed, that there's a risk that if nothing else changes in 5 years' time, what we'll see is a pattern where women have chosen, particularly women in the family formation stage, have chosen disproportionately to work at home. Men have been much more regular attenders at the office, and that very visibility, if nothing else changes, will show in who is being considered for promotion, who's being considered for sponsorship, mentorship, who's being put on the best of the training opportunities, because the women will be kind of invisible behind the screen. And another thing I can certainly feel with the organisations that I work with, that whilst the virtual working did keep us going, the longer it's gone, the more your organisation does become fractured along silo lines. So you might have a very productive working relationship with your immediate team, but the further you get from that, the less sort of cultural, strategic, organisational cohesion you've got across the organisation. And when the project of equality is to make such a big difference across structures and cultures, I think that fragmentation is a bit concerning. But are there other observations about how we could be grasping the moment in a positive way, or dangers to look out for? Mary, did you want to?
We see with particularly some of our employers of choice, we're hearing some of the stories about what people are doing and how they're managing it. And it's absolutely critical about being intentional and measuring and monitoring the impacts of that, exactly as you've said. We've got one employer of choice, Medibank, who talk about work as something you do, not somewhere you go, which really appealed to me in terms of thinking about it. But they have, for example, that all roles are flex, and you have to justify why you're required to be in the office on certain days or from home, and you work up a program for the employee for how it works for them. And if there's that flexibility there to have those conversations. They also have been very intentional about why you need to be in the office and what you're achieving in that time, and what the objectives are there. I think it's also important that we expand the definition of flex as working from home or not. There's other flexible work, and people say, well, what about in workplaces where you have to be present? Well, maybe you could work longer days, or 4 days in 5, or job share, and some of those areas that haven't had the same focus, but build up the picture of what flex looks like so that it can work both for men and women, as long as companies are then making sure they're very purposefully measuring the impact of that, and that it's not a gendered outcome as well.
So just a couple of comments. The first, I think, in terms of one of the benefits we can harness, is just that we've mainstreamed it more. When we've tended to have more women working from home or flexibly before, we've had more men that have had that experience and understand more, the pros and cons and how to set it up. So I think that that's something that we can build on. But I do want to cover, I guess, that there's great disparities from an equity perspective, just in terms of, people's salaries or the types of jobs that they do. So, for example, one of the things that we identified at Future Super is that people that had high incomes were more likely to have a home office or, to have facilities at home, whereas other people weren't, and they were in share houses and they were just starting out. They were living at home. It was much harder for them to do their jobs from home. So we introduced an allowance, and we still have that for remote working, where everyone that's paid a base of under $120,000 gets a $100 fortnightly allowance to help them, be able to work from home effectively and be set up for that. So I think that that's quite important, and having facilities for people to go into the office if they need to, for a whole range of reasons. The other practice that I'm aware of with one of the other companies that I work with is, this was pre-pandemic, but they still have it now, is that whenever there's somebody working flexibly and joining by video or joining by phone, everybody has to do that. So rather than having the dynamic that leads to what you're talking about in terms of visibility in the office, so if they've got a meeting and 5 people are in the office and 3 people are working remotely, the 5 in the office go and they dial into the video from their desks rather than sitting in the meeting room. And that's been the common practice and worked well then during COVID, and continues to make sure that there's that equality in terms of how people are showing up at the meeting, and there's not sort of a side meeting going on as part of that meeting. So I think we have to be really intentional about some of those practices.
Yeah, I do think over time we're also going to see more and more technological developments that even if some people are in a room, the vision that you're getting, I mean, this is already happening, the vision you're getting if you're dialed in remotely and your sense of presence in the room is different than, a lot of people would only have the technology now where if you've dialed in remotely, you can just see tiny little people that big all gathered around a meeting table and you're so visibly on the outside of it. I think that will shift. Nikki, is there anything you wanted to say about this COVID moment and as we design the new world, what we could be doing better on gender?
Yeah, I think it's probably mostly already been said. I wrote an op-ed for a Victorian newspaper a couple of weeks ago about proximity bias, that potential for you not being present and not being seen and so forth, and the need for us not to say, well, we're not having flexibility because of that, but to actually deal with it, which is what both Mary and Geraldine have just spoken about. I think my own experience was, and the experience of my team was, I got the job, came into Victoria to set up a commission under lockdown, and so we've been a virtual team for the entirety of implementing this legislation. Some of my team members I didn't meet in person for months and months and months, and so now we can't say, well, you have to come into the office, because we know that everyone's been able to work perfectly well, some from their home bedrooms and things like that. But we do now have an office, and we've made a commitment, different to what you were saying, Geraldine, that every meeting, every event, we will have a hybrid option. So we have got people in the team in the workplace and online, and so far that's actually working well. But I guess we're very used to that environment. It's new for us to actually come and be together as a team, but it's a unique experience, I think, particularly to us.
Can I just add that I think one of the key things we've seen, like many things that COVID's done, is it's spotlighted poor leadership practices and poor management practices. And it's helped us to see that, in fact, that management by control or management by presentism was always ineffective. The focus on outcomes is what we really need to focus on. And there's in the recent Global Institute paper, Manuela Tomei, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, talked about what would a gendered equal approach to remote working look like. And her point was supporting managers in dispersed workforces to shift away from management by control to management by results. And I think that's really at the heart of how we enable the hybrid and the remote working to work.
But we're going to have to train our middle managers. I think that's the thing that follows your point, Jane, is the middle managers is where they're going to bear the brunt of this. So we've got to put the skill building in for that management in a hybrid context that no one's developed that training yet. And so that's the gap that we need to get onto, I think, to make sure then it can succeed within organisations and people can manage teams effectively.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then, of course, there is, you know, if you meet people for the first time that you've only been dealing with on Zoom, the wow, you're really tall effect, or maybe that only happens to me, but everybody seems taller than I imagined they were going to be. Geraldine, I'm going to come to you on the question of money, because you know a lot about money and you know a lot about investing and you know a lot about ethical investing. And, you know, many sources of capital now are being very discriminating on environmental grounds and other ethical grounds. So they, you know, don't want to put their money into a business that isn't doing the right thing by climate change. They'd be much prefer to direct their investments to, you know, organisations and businesses that are on the right side of climate change history. You know, there's all sorts of other ethical reasons people look at when they're investing. There's been a lot of campaigning, for example, on the anti-slavery work to make sure that nowhere in your investment chain or your supply chain is anybody using forced labour, and the list goes on. But in a world where there is quite a long list of things for an ethical investor to consider, how do we make sure gender equality, diversity more broadly are on that list, that they're preferring businesses that are an employer of choice, to use the language that we've been using now?
Yeah, absolutely. So perhaps I'll start just by talking about some of the approaches that we take at Future Super. So we were set up to really create a future free from climate change and inequality. And if we look at the way that we invest, for example, in listed equities and for our Verve Super fund, we don't invest in any companies that don't have at least one female director on the board. And then in terms of Verve Super, as I'm sure you may know, we actually created a special index based off the WGEA data. We set out a number of things that were important to us from a gender equality perspective and built a special index that's used for the Verve Super Fund that only invests in companies that are hitting good data. So again, it shows the value of having this public data, and then we can then do that. Now we do that in addition to screening for fossil fuels and climate change and so on. And really what we're trying to do is drive systemic change. So for us, success is that everyone's investing in that way and really trying to use the power of your money to invest from that perspective. So we think it's just good business. It's just social license to operate, to focus on gender equality and to focus on these issues. And I think it's becoming increasingly important to the generations that are coming through. So I think we're starting to really see people shifting their money and really focusing on it. So for me, it's not an either or. I think we have to do both. And I think we've seen that really clearly come through from the Australian population as well in the last couple of weeks in terms of that theme of doing both. So there's ways to do it. It's important, and more companies are starting to do it. But again, I think just like ASIC's been looking at greenwashing in terms of people saying that they're doing it, but not actually doing it, we need to think about how we're doing the same around gender equality. So organisations, you know, saying that they're investing their money in that way, or even, you know, saying that they've got the gender approaches, but aren't doing it really. So we need to make sure that ASIC's looking out for that as well in terms of how we communicate and what you're able to say about how you invest.
How widespread, though, do you think that equality piece is? I mean, I can, you know, absolutely there would be a lot of investment vehicles now that would be very aware that if they invested in a way that was seen to be counter to the climate change agenda, that there would be a real reputational risk around that. Do you think that in the broader investing market, people sense that there's also emerging reputational risks around not doing due diligence on gender and diversity? Or is that we're just at the start of that? And if so, what more can and should we be doing? I mean, you know, people in the audience here probably thinking to themselves, I'd love to run a venture capital fund, but I don't. You know, are there things that individuals can be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, look, I think climate has definitely become really significant. And again, we've seen that with the influence that Mike Cannon-Brookes has had on the AGL demerger in the last couple of weeks. So I think decisions like that get people to sit up and say, hang on, this is really coming. And every board in Australia will be looking around and saying, you know, what kind of exposure do we have in terms of the way we make decisions? I don't think we're as progressed in terms of gender equality in terms of the decision-making process. But I think we are more progressed in terms of having some of the data and the metrics to make those decisions from. And there's been a really big movement around that. I think, you know, the more that WGEA, that everyone starts publishing data around who doesn't have female directors, who doesn't have the gender equality. And I think this goes to what you're saying in terms of the next iteration and building on WGEA in terms of having that greater transparency, because we don't always have the greater transparency around things like pay equity, around those policies. Certainly, I think in the work that I've done with going around and speaking to institutional investors and those that are taking votes in terms of at the annual general meetings, they're starting to ask more questions. So with BlackRock and others really starting to drive that movement and ask questions of companies, what are you doing about gender? What are you doing about sustainability? That's getting boards, chairs, chairs of remuneration committees to sit up and kind of watch what's going. So I think in terms of as individuals, what we can do is we can move our own money. We can really ask those questions of our, funds, of our investors, and where we're investing our own personal money. Obviously, we can also ask questions within our own companies about what's happening in terms of how we're investing money, and really, really hold our companies to account internally as well. And then we can support the movement to greater reporting and more data that helps us to make these decisions.
In the minutes that remain to us, I want to circle back to where I started. Obviously, we're here. There's a new government. What if you were giving the incoming minister, if you were writing here you are, please do the following three things, what would those three things be? And please don't confine yourself necessarily to the person holding the equality portfolio. If you were thinking about everything that government does and you're in a position to slip a post-it note in that said do this, or slip 3 post-it notes in, I'm not meaning to imply from that ministers only read post-it notes. That's not true. Please do not walk away with that impression. But what would you put on it?
Oh, I had the magic wand question here because I've heard your podcast and you asked that question. I would have acts like the Gender Equality Act in Victoria right across Australia. I think, and like the workplace gender equality, the sorts of extensions to it that Mary's talking about. I think this is, it's not the only way, it's not the silver bullet, but it's a really important thing to do. But there are all the other things as well that support women working, and we need men to take on the responsibility for caring and emotional work if we're ever going to have equality. So if I could wave my magic wand and suggest some ways to government to do that, I would certainly be pushing that along, as well as things like universal childcare and paid parental leave that requires men to take it or lose it, basically.
Those magic wands, unfortunately, are in short supply, aren't they? Hard to get your hand on one. But if you had one, Jane, what would you do?
Certainly the childcare issue, I think that is very much on the agenda, and obviously KPMG has been very vocal in the support for that, both the societal as well as the economic benefits of greater investment in the childcare subsidy. So I think that is on the agenda, and I would put that at the top of the list. I expect on the basis that without that, we're just not getting the full participation of women in particular in the workplace. Indigenous reconciliation would be at the very top of my list. Again, a broader equality issue. And I think as well, some of the commentary, I would echo your point about the commentary about the work that you do, Mary, with your agency, and continuing to strengthen that.
Geraldine.
So before the election, the Chief Executive Women put together a very compelling research-based platform, and I'm very supportive of the key 4 recommendations that they had. So first of all, would be investing in a well-paid, secure care sector, because I think the more that we can get, better pay and better conditions into childcare and education and aged care is fundamental in terms of achieving gender equality, and gender pay equality, both for those in the sector, but also supporting more women to be able to participate in the workforce. The second thing is that I would expand the Commonwealth paid parental leave, really take that to at least 26 weeks, preferably 52, and really have that shared, equal share, so a use it or lose it provision in terms of making sure that that's shared across men and women, because I think the more that both men and women are involved in the early stages, the more likely that's going to be reflected going through, the different stages of parenting. And then universal childcare. Get more childcare. And I think this is a particularly an equality issue, because we really do need to know. I mean, I think we started talking about some of the issues around, sort of people that do have more money. We often talk about, directors and senior leadership, but we really need to make sure that everybody makes sense for everybody to be able to get into the workforce, and that it doesn't cost more for childcare or for early childhood, education. So I would absolutely put that in place. I think that's fundamental.
I feel we're all in furious agreement here. So let me, in addition to everything that's been said, I think there's a real opportunity, especially with the focus on childcare and some of the low-paying care and sectors, is to really try and take, and it's probably a generational change, but address feminised and masculinised industries and really go to gender stereotypes, which often underpin a lot of the issues that we have in workplaces across the board, and certainly in some of our highly gender segregated workforces. So I think not only addressing some of the pay issues, but really going to the heart of why is the care sector 80% women? Why have we only got, 20% women working in some of the construction and mining and more masculinised industries, and how do we create different pathways? And a significant part of that is pay, but there's a lot of stereotypes that are behind that we need to shift as well. In addition to, of course, childcare and parental leave, and of course enhancing our capacity as a collector of information and a driver of change. So lots of agreement there across the panel, I think.
I think a lot of agreement. I think that magic wand would be nice to find. We're searching for it. But whilst we're handing out post-it notes for action, for the people in our audience today, if you could set them a bit of homework about what they could take out of today's discussion and potentially do in their own workplace, their own organisation. Obviously, people will be at different occupations, different positions, but are there sort of things that people can take from today as an action step themselves?
I guess if your organisation isn't already doing it, encourage a workplace gender equality audit. Have a good look at where you stand. You hear whenever you ask organisations who haven't done it, they always say, "Well, there's not a problem with our workplace," but invariably they will find something that is. That does need to be addressed in terms of gender inequality. And I think the starting point is, if you're not already doing it, do an audit and then make a plan to act on anything that needs to be done to address any inequality that you find.
I think one of the most critical things to do is to influence your organisation to make parental leave about men and women, not just about mothers. We've recently done that at KPMG, and the signalling that it gives to our organisation, that's got a long pay forward on it in terms of generational change and men talking about that it doesn't disrupt your career. It's a moment in time, and you do come back in and you are able to continue with a long and productive career despite the fact that you've taken time off to look after your children, and obviously all of the societal benefits that go with that as well. So that'd be the top of the list for me.
So I'd urge everyone to really think about the role of bias and unconscious bias. recognise that we all have a form of bias, and start with that in a few ways. One, in terms of thinking about the fact that bias is formed in the early years, really if you've got children or you're interacting with our kids, really thinking about how you're breaking down stereotypes and helping to expose them to a wide range of, cultural experiences, and seeing, equal caregiving, and really starting to think about how we have respectful relationships really early on. And then within the workforce, really thinking about how do you be aware of biases, and when do you take systemic interventions to tackle them. So for example, there's great platforms out there like Applied, where you can do de-identified recruiting, where you're not looking at CVs, where you're not looking at names, but all of your candidates are answering a set of questions, and then you assess the candidates based on their answers to those questions and compare the questions rather than comparing the candidates. So there's nudges like that can help us to address some of that bias. So think about what are the right interventions for your organisation to acknowledge we all have bias, how are we going to address it.
And one of our best kept secrets, I think, is that on the WGEA website, we have a wealth of information about every employer, private sector employer with more than 100 employees. It doesn't have the remuneration data yet, but it has everything else. It's got boards, it's got makeup of the management and non-managers, it's got, have they done a gender pay gap audit, and what action was taken as a result, or why didn't they take action? What are the policies and practices in place? So you can actually go and have a look at your own employer or anyone that you're thinking about going and working for, and then ask the question, start the conversation, generate that discussion about, well, what have we done? Why haven't we done it? How is that? What impact has that had? And be part of the momentum for change. But being informed by the information, there, and we're really trying to raise the profile that this information is available. We want people to use it and then use that to be a driver of change.
Thank you very much. You come to a discussion at a university, you get homework. That's just the way that it is. But I am going to thank people for coming and thank the panel just in those brief words. But what I'm really going to do is invite Professor Michelle Ryan back onto the stage. Michelle.
Everyone join me in thanking our chair.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening, and particularly for staying, if you stayed on till the end to listen to that really informative discussion. Yeah, catch you next time. Finish recording. Yo, James.